Well, hello there and welcome. We are here to learn more about FileMaker Pro, aren't we? My name is Matt Petrowski. I'm glad you've stopped by this video, and today we're taking a look at layout objects. All of the different things that we use in the layout, just go through the nuances and all kinds of different things about those little buggers. Stick with me, we'll be on my desktop in just a few. All right, so what do we have for today? Well, it's those layout objects. Now, before we get started, if you happen to find this video as a result of a YouTube search or somehow you were pointed to it, maybe somebody shared the video, you can see that we're on lesson 13 right now. I think that's what it is. Let me check off screen here. Yes, lesson 13. Also check my feed. So when I look off to the side, I'm looking at my other monitor there. Click on the channel icon. That will take you to my channel. You'll be able to find all of the different series that I've provided here on YouTube, all of them for free. Of course, if you'd like more content like this, you're always welcome to check out exactly what you see on screen, FileMakerMagazine.com. Also, down in the description below, you will find a link to the file that I will be using. As I bring that up, I am using a copy of FileMaker 16 as I record this video, but of course with FileMaker, a lot of what we learn applies to many different versions. It's just nuances with each version to know whether or not you have that feature or not in your copy of FileMaker. For example, if you're using 14.16, you don't have card windows, which is what I have here in FileMaker 16. All right, so let's hop into the content. Just before we do that, let me give a shout out to our sponsor here.
This video has been brought to you by FileMakerThemes.com. It's a one-stop shop for choosing a theme to apply to your new or existing FileMaker solution. When considering your next move toward advancing the look and feel of your FileMaker solution, don't forget to visit FileMakerThemes.com.
All right, and I do have a theme from FileMaker Themes embedded into the file that you are downloading. I forget what it's called, but we can see that in the layout mode. It is Sandstone Parkway. I can see right there the theme that's being used. But we are here to learn about layout objects. We are in the process of cleaning this layout up. And there's a number of things that when you know about the layout objects and how a lot of them work, and when I refer to layout objects, I'm referring to all of the things that you can possibly add to your layout, a given object. Now, each of those objects have a name, clearly. We've been working with those. As I bring the inspector on screen, what FileMaker calls them is very easy to discover because you're just going to go to the third area in the inspector, which if you do not know where the inspector is, it's going to be under the View menu right here, and you've got the inspector. And now here's a little tip. Notice that we've got this option right here of a new inspector. You can have as many inspectors on screen as you want, and each of them, as I open up new inspectors, each of them can be on a different tab of all of the inspector tabs. So you can see I've got 3 inspectors here on screen now. So if I had a large enough real estate to work with all of my layout objects, I can put this one on the position, this one on the styles, which that one's less common, and this one on the appearance, as the tooltip shows me right there. This is probably more of a common setup if you have a lot of real estate and you want to leave all of these open. These are the 3 most heavily used areas of the inspector palette. Unless you're doing a lot of styling, this second area of styles really isn't used a whole lot. So the position, the appearance, and then the data tabs are pretty much most of where you deal with things. Now notice there are keyboard shortcuts that I've told you about in previous videos of Command 1, 2, and 3. So this one corresponds to 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you switch those, FileMaker will pick the palette, as I switch here, the first palette that was selected, unless the tab isn't showing. So you notice that as I hit Command 1, it switched on this inspector, but that's because when I hit Command 2, this palette was on that one. Here, I'll show you again. So I only have 1, 3 and areas 4 selected. So FileMaker has to pick one of these palettes. If I hit Command 2 to go to styles, and it switches it to it, and it's whatever the frontmost palette is, or if you clicked over here, whichever was the first loaded. Once I do that, it really messes up my flow. Now, when I do the command, see what I did? I did Command 3, which switched this palette because it was active, did Command 4, and it jumped over to the other palette. So that's the problem with multiple palettes if you're using the keyboard commands, because with one inspector open, you can just do the Command 1, Command 2, Command 3, Command 4 in order to cycle through those. But if you use multiple palettes, using the command keys won't work as well because you'll get palette hopping all over the place. That's essentially what I was trying to say. So in order to know what an object is, obviously when you have that object selected, FileMaker will tell you, and this is pretty much the only place right here. Under the Style settings in the Appearance tab, you can see what an object is, whether it's text, etc. So you probably already know that, but let's spend a little bit of time learning about these objects, some of the settings that they have that are unique, and some tricks that you can use when you're dealing with these objects. One of them in particular that a lot of developers don't necessarily know about is there is a toggle mode between the arrow selection tool and the most recently used tool, and that happens to be the Enter key. So on your extended keyboard over on where they've got the 10 keypad, if you have the Enter key as opposed to the Return key, if you hit that, what should happen is I will make a selection of this shape tool. I will add a shape, and notice that as soon as I release the shape, FileMaker defaults back to the selection arrow. So if I wanted to add multiples of those, I'll show you how to do that. But what FileMaker remembers is it remembers the last used tool prior to coming back to the selection arrow. So if I hold down, I've got a function key, and the function key on a shorter keyboard for the Macintosh should trigger the Enter. On a US keyboard, if you look at the keyboard, it has the word Enter above the word Return. You should be able to, I don't know if this will do it. Nope, it doesn't do it in my particular case. The function key, I'm using a Logitech keyboard, and if I was using a Macintosh keyboard, where the function key would actually translate. In this case, mine doesn't. But on your keyboard, if it's a Macintosh native keyboard or a wired keyboard, something where the function key does translate, Logitech does some funny things with their control panel for me. It should toggle between the two tools. It should have toggled back over to this and then toggled back to this when I hit that Return key, which is really pretty helpful every once in a while. So likewise, there is another trick that you can do with the layout objects when you are wanting to deal with any given object and create more than one, and that is simply double-click the tool. So if I click 2 times here, you notice that if I click the line once, it's now just a light color. But if I click 2 times, it puts the tool into a locked state, which is really pretty nice. So if I needed multiple shapes, I can now make a shape, make another shape, well, as long as my clicker will work there, my mouse, I can make as many shapes as I need. Now, in order to get out of this double locked mode, if my Enter key was working, I would be able to enter and it would pop me back over onto the selection tool, which this is really helpful when you're dealing with a lot of things, in particular text. So this is where I've used it the most. Double click the text tool and I can now click in to edit this text, edit this text, edit this text, and so forth. So the trick here is, if I know that I am going to have a bunch of field labels, let me show you a nice little layout trick with any of the layout objects when we're dealing with them. I'll add some text. I don't know why my computer does this, but it makes the text really a small little thing. It's really funky. I've never taken the time to figure out why. But FileMaker, when we're working in layout mode and we're designing and we want to get a lot of things on the layout quickly, and we want them to be equally spaced, there's 2 options that we could do. We could use the Position tab, and we could use the spacing options that we have right here in order to distribute either horizontally or vertically all of the objects. Or there's a nice trick where with a single object selected, if we duplicate that object, which I'm going to do right now with Command D, if we don't deselect that object, FileMaker has remembered the last sequence of steps. So right now, with this object duplicated, if I hit the Tab key, or hit the arrow key, Notice the little blue arrow that just showed me that everything lined up. So I'm going to arrow over here, and I get that blue line on screen that we saw right there. Now I'm going to arrow down so that it's a little bit of a distance, and I can see that it's lining up with either the bottom of, it's probably the top of the timestamp right here. But the key thing is I have not deselected this. So that last duplicate that I did remembers the sequence that I just performed, which was a duplicate and then a move over and a move down. So now if I hit Command or Control D again, I get that same sequence of steps. With Command D, it puts the label down, realigns it, and puts it under. So I could get a number of these all equally spaced without having to select all of them and then go use the spacing tools right here. Of course, there's nothing wrong with using the spacing tools. So, what else do we have here? So I told you about the double lock. The double lock is really helpful. I've used it mostly with the text tool. I've also told you about the enter to toggle between the two states. You, of course, should know that you can select on any one of these and make a change. Now, when it comes to a rectangle versus a rounded rectangle versus a oval, these two objects in particular, just for your information, there's no real distinguishing between the two in FileMaker, these later versions of FileMaker. It's FileMaker 12 and later, and that's because it used to be that FileMaker had two distinct different objects, one a rounded rectangle and one a rectangle. But nowadays, if you just make a rectangle, all you're going to do is in the Appearance tab, you're just going to control that corner radius, and you're going to be able to say, okay, this is 10 points. That now just became a rounded rectangle, and underneath the hood, they're just the same object. So if I had selected rounded rectangle and just added that, they may be distinguished a little bit in their XML, how they're stored. But for the most part, these objects are pretty much identical in terms of their use. So whether you start with a regular rectangle or rounded rectangle, that one doesn't matter. The oval, however, is a different object or a different shape. Also notice that when I'm dragging here, FileMaker always drags, like most tools, or drags out objects from the topmost corner. We can also see that I get the tooltip that's telling me it's 48 points wide by 16 high. But on every object, there are constrain keys that we have, and those are Shift and Option. So if we hold down the Option key, what happens is FileMaker attempts to it makes it constrained to a equal sized object. That works for text boxes, fields, containers, what have you. I've used it most for containers. So when I drag out a field, which I will do right now, if this field was a container field, which I don't have any currently, I'll just select type. Just starting to drag, and then as soon as you hold down the Option key, popping that into a square is really beneficial. And you can see that it's actually popping to my grid as we have turned on, which we learned about a couple lessons ago, which I can turn off the grid by going here. I should have just not collapsed that. I can turn off this snap to grid right here so that I don't get that snapping. And I can then make it whatever size I want. Also note that all of these key combinations are really helpful when you're doing your layout. If the snap to grid was turned on and it was popping to the grid and I wanted that perfect square holding down the Option key, I can bypass the grid or any grid lines on the Macintosh at least by holding the Command key. So the Command key is now allowing me to do this by single point increments despite the fact that the grid is turned on. So that's a real big help because I can keep the grid on, work to the grid, but then if I need to size an object, I can just temporarily bypass the grid. It's the same thing that we learned just a little bit ago with our body parts. If we want to bypass or ghost through objects, when we drag them, if we hold down the Option key, it will drag and ghost through all of the objects rather than sizing the part with the objects within it. All right, fields. Fields, anytime that you add, that you need a new field, there are multiple ways to add field objects. My typical approach is to simply just take a field that's already on the screen and just Option drag that. You can see the plus sign right there. We get that plus. I've stated it so many times, though, if you do this, the problem is you're taking along any other attributes that you've applied to that object. That means your hide calculation, your conditional formatting, your tooltips, your, what is it? I forget what it's called. Let's see right here. It is placeholder text. And I think there's one other that I forget comes along. But there is something interesting to note when you're copying fields. I'll show you that. But my point of saying right here is I don't take the time to make the switch here. I don't take the time to say, this to me is extra effort. Okay, I want to create a pop-up box, and I'm going to drag that out, and then I'm going to say I want that to be the duration right there. For me, once you get used to your command keys of 1, 2, and 3 on your inspector, it's so much easier for me to just go select this, go Command 4, I'm right there, and just switch to whatever object type I want. So when you make a selection here, you're not making a definitive selection that says this is going to forever be a drop-down list. Every field object can be changed at any point in time when you're designing in your layout. So I rarely go and make a selection here because I'm copying the field and then saying what I want it to be. But here's the trick about fields. When it comes to copying a field, if you copy a single field in FileMaker by the method that I showed, an option drag, with a single field, FileMaker is going to prompt you for what do you want this field to be. In other words, I can reassign this field. So I can say this copy of the description, I want to instead assign it to be the type. Now I want you to contrast that to if I have more than one selected, FileMaker can't give me that particular option. So I'm going to hold down Shift, select now type and description. And if I option drag both of these, note that I don't get that dialog box. The dialog box does not come up for me to make a selection to reassign. But of course, with fields, we can always reassign there's a number of ways. We can click on the field itself, go up to here, click the little pencil icon. If we want to say, I don't want this description, I want it to be the ID parent. Or we can double click the field. That's the easiest way. That's what I typically use. Or we can right click on the field if it will right click. I don't know why that right click is going all the way over there. I've got something funky going on where it's selecting that button. I select the field. I'm now right clicking the field and it's hopping over to projects. I don't know what's going on with my computer, but something. And ultimately we would have an option within here if it would stay selected on the field. Is it because I am... There we go. Don't know why it was doing that, but specify field is the third way that you would be able to change this particular field to a different field, to whatever you want. And we'll have to get into selection tools, or how you select objects. There's a lot of really nice ways to select objects. So I typically don't change this. If you like to, then all the power to you. With buttons and popovers, this is one of the areas. These are the two that I do make selections. So I rarely make selections right here and change to ovals unless I need ovals. So this is almost always rectangles. This is almost always the edit field, the standard field, and then I use the inspector to change. This one I do have to make selections. So between buttons and popovers, I make the selection, and on tab panels between tab controls and sliders, I typically end up having to make those selections. Now remember, in a previous video, my suggestion to you was that as FileMaker advances, we have a lot of old things in FileMaker that are coming all the way back from FileMaker 3, and a standard button is one that doesn't have as much flexibility and control as we have with a newer object, which would be our button bar. But when we select a button bar and we drag this out, FileMaker for some reason decides that you must want 3 segments to your button bar every time. No thank you, FileMaker. I don't. I would prefer to be able to have 1 segment, but I get what they're doing. They're trying to say, oh look, you can have more than 1 segment, so I have to go in and get rid of the segments I don't want to make it a single segment button bar, which in my opinion is a better tool to use in your modern development. If you're developing with any database starting with 14 and higher, just use that. You do not need to use a standard button object unless you know that you do, because you get a lot more benefits with the button bar setup. So yeah, the button bar, it's by itself. We have our segments. I've discussed that one a couple of times. The tab controls, make selections there. Portals, we will talk about those. Charts, and then web viewers. Here we have our, dragging a field out. There are so many ways to add a field to a FileMaker layout. Let's go through those. You can select here. Well, first off, here was our first option. We chose a given field. Let's say we want a checkbox set. We drag that out. We say, okay, value list is missing, of course, because we haven't assigned it. So I'd have to make a trip over to the inspector here anyway to assign a value list. Let's go projects right there. That's option number 1. Option number 2 is I can select and drag out a field right here. Of course, when I do that, it's going to prompt for the field. And then I would have to go do the process that I do when I duplicate a field anyway, which is go over here and say, no, I want this to be a checkbox set, and I want the value list to be projects. And then we've got option number 3. If I hold down Command K or Control K if you're on Windows, we get the field picker. And here we can drag a field out. Now, when I was discussing the environment all the way back, I covered this, but for those of you that are finding this video for the first time, maybe you haven't gone through that, you can select as many fields as you want in the field picker. And down at the bottom, we have these options, which are really pretty nice. We can have FileMaker automatically create labels for us, either above, to the side, or this one is not, it doesn't put a label behind. It puts the placeholder text within. And then this one puts nothing. And of course, we can have a vertical or a horizontal alignment for all of these fields. So that is a pretty nice feature, and I find myself using that every once in a while when I need to do my layout design, but I'm so used to my old method of this, and I'll show you why. I just showed you previously. So here is option number 1 for when we're going to add these fields. I just drag them out, and FileMaker just throws them onto the layout. Now, the issue that I have with this is that when I use this, FileMaker uses the current styling according to the defaults. So the default styling for a text block would need to be according to the way that I like to have the field, which is typically aligned. We can see that in this theme, because it is a theme from FileMaker Themes, it is aligned the way that I want, but it's aligned to the right, which maybe I want it aligned to the left or something else pretty specific. So given that FileMaker has only one way to get this out of the field picker dialog box, here is my typical method for adding multiple objects. What I've already expressed is I will typically get everything looking how I want with the first instance of that object. So maybe I'll do this right here. We'll hide the field picker. I will zoom in a little bit or zoom out a little bit. Use my position tab. For some reason, you call me a neurotic developer or a designer, I should say, but I like things to be equal. When this is not the same height and I have to take the time to align this and I'm using the snapping is good and it'll work, I'm not very fond of that, because if I wanted this text to be aligned to the center of this, I would have to go to the position, arrange, align, and then I'd have to take the time to click on the align horizontal centers in order to get everything to look, squared up. That's much more of a hassle than just doing this. Make sure that this snaps to the top and the bottom of that field. The height of my label is the same as the height of my field. I give it all of the space around it, the balance that I'd like to have. And then I just select both of those and I do that duplication trick. So I'll duplicate this and I'll tap it until I get it to line up. Now notice that with multiple objects selected, that little blue line doesn't come up anymore. So we sort of have to know what FileMaker does for the duplicate. That's really easy to determine because we look at the position, which is currently 819. If I duplicate this and just say whatever field, FileMaker, and I go over and go to 19. Oh, I didn't look at what it was. Silly me. 828, 19, so it's 9 pixels is what they're doing right there. I think that's what it is. But Select both of those. I duplicate, go over 9 pixels, whatever it is, and then go down. Now I just duplicate all of those, and I can see it's off, but I have what I want. So now the easy way is, or the quick way, and I suggest that you do this as you're following along in this video. I'm obviously going to want each of these fields to be something different. Maybe it's the first name, the last name, then whatever, then whatever. If I had used FileMaker's drag method to drag those out, the problem is I would still have to do some realignment and some arranging on the layout. Whereas right here, if I start with the first one that I want and then duplicate into a pattern that's consistent with how I want the fields to look, the renaming of these is really pretty quick because I can just go double click, I want that to be that one, double click, I want that to be that one, double click this one to be this one, and this one to be this one. Then I use the tip that I just gave you. I double click on the text tool to lock it. Then I can just go in and go first, last, city, state. It's really pretty quick in order to do this type of modification. Whatever. And then I hit my enter, and I'm done. So that type of design approach, when I'm adding layout objects to my layout, I find that to be much faster than having to play with the arrange tools because I've already put it into the format that I want. And hopefully that makes sense and is helpful. We might as well talk about selection when it comes to selecting your layout objects. We're on the topic of layout objects, and I'm not going to be able to go through every detail of every object. When we get to those objects, I'll probably express what I know about them. Additionally, say for example, tab controls, but those are pretty easy, adding a number of tabs. Selecting objects in your layout, we talked about just a few lessons ago, the new palette that we have in FileMaker 16, the Layout Objects palette. Now that is super helpful for making selections, and I gave you all kinds of tips in that video. Go watch it if you want to know how to select all of a given kind or all of an opposite kind, doing inverse selections, all kinds of other things. But when you're designing on the layout and you want to be able to grab objects and do it in a way where you can get what you want, knowing how the selection tool works in particular is really helpful. So the selection tool that we're talking about right here, there's a couple of different ways that you can select things. If you never learn this trick, it becomes much more cumbersome to work with your layout objects, unless you use the Layout Objects palette. But say, for example, I want to select all of these labels, and I want all of these fields as well so that I can use the alignment tool. Well, the easiest way to select all of them, the fields right here, is I can just marquee across all of them. Now, the way that the selection tool works is this. Anything that falls underneath the marquee will be selected. So if I just simply switch my selection here, it's going to select everything now. And we can see that if I wanted to take the time, I could select close enough right here to the field where I'm going to marquee just on the fields and then drag over, and I will get just the tip of all of the labels. So you notice that as soon as I go past that object right here up in the very top corner there, you notice it's grabbing that that text. And then if I went a little bit further, we can see that as I drag, it's now highlighting because what falls underneath the marquee is my tab panel. Well, sometimes that just does not work. You just want to grab something, but you do have objects on the layout that are stacked, where you've got objects that are above or below. So you really need to know that they're the modifier key of the command key in conjunction with the selection tool changes the behavior of the selection tool. So what it does is it changes it from a everything that falls underneath to an everything that falls within. And so now if I hold down the command key, notice that as I drag, nothing is getting selected, but as I marquee, as soon as I hit around all of the objects, any objects that fall within the bounding area of the selection will be selected. So because I knew that this tab panel extends all the way off the layout, I knew that I would be able to select all of just my labels and then be able to do whatever I want to them in order to affect them. And so here I could align them all to their edges so that they all become aligned. Here I know that nothing is in the way, so I select and marquee, and then I align all of those, and then of course I can use my arrow keys or drag in order to align them and get everything exactly how I want. So those selections become really, really helpful. Here I can just simply, I know that my selection will pass across just those objects. I can now get rid of them and delete them. I'm back to what I want. But the trick is, with that selection here, I know that there is this box and there is this box. If I wanted just this box and there was a bunch of other elements around this, let's say, for example, I had some text. Let's create the situation that we might have. I've got this text, and for some reason, the block is overlapping right here, and I want to be able to select this. And it's usually my objects will be aligned like this, where this is sort of hard. I know I can click underneath here in order to select this, but a lot of the times going outside of where you want to select and selecting either horizontally or vertically to grab what you want is really pretty helpful. So out here, if I use that modifier of the command key in order to select and marquee all the way from the outside, I just barely got it there, but you can see that I selected both of those objects that were in line there, that creation timestamp and the rectangle, which is obscuring some of the data. Now if I hold down the shift key and deselect, so a lot of the times taking off of your selection what you've selected, knowing that you're going to have to do that, is a little bit better way, especially when you get a really complex layout in FileMaker. And these tips, they really saved me a lot of time in terms of making selections. Of course, the layout palette, or the layout objects palette, is really helpful now, where before you had to know these tricks in order to get the exact selection that you wanted without messing up your layout. And of course, when it comes to your layout objects, please remember that you can take advantage of all of the features that you have available to you for each layout object. And typically that's going to be found under the Arrange menu, where you're dealing with objects. You're going to have the Align, the Distribute, the Resize. Those are all corresponding to the what we have on the inspector right here. So everything in the Arrange, Align in the inspector here corresponds to those menu commands. But when it comes to, say, for example, this object right here, this tab panel, I have specifically made it the same size as the layout part that is within it. If I don't want changes to happen to this object, lock it. You can lock it from the menu, or you can simply right-click, and under the Arrange menu, you will have the Group, Ungroup, Lock, and Unlock. Which also leads me to grouping and ungrouping. Let's talk about that. When it comes to layout objects, I have to be honest, I rarely, if ever, use grouping or ungrouping. There's a reason for that, and I'll tell you why. We'll look at an example why I don't use grouping. There isn't a problem with using grouping. You can certainly use it. But one of the issues that we have is each individual object in FileMaker's layout can have settings. And when you group an object, FileMaker creates a container around those objects where it can additionally have its own properties. Now, sometimes that's beneficial. Sometimes, say for example, I have two text blocks. Let's take copies of these. I'll have this one, and I'll have something here, and I'll have something else. So we've got two objects right here. Now if I select both of these and then I choose to select both of them, and can I right click? No, for some reason that clicking is not working when I'm zoomed in. We'll go to Arrange and we will group them now, or use Command R. So they are now grouped. What's nice is I now have the ability to set, say for example, for this group of these two objects, one hide behavior. So if I put on a true for this one object and we go into browse mode here and do not save, both of those will be hidden. And there are some tricks that we can do with the hide. So I didn't have to put a hide calculation on this one and a hide calculation on this one. But the difficulty that I find with this solution, or this, I wouldn't call it a solution, but this method, is that I lose my individual settings on, or I don't lose them, but they become obscured, my individual settings on these objects. So what I mean by that, as I ungroup them, is number one, Had I selected this, and this is what I would call the worst case scenario, had I chosen the format and used button setup. Now, if you are doing this, or if you see, I've seen videos on YouTube that still continue to suggest this. Please don't do this as a new FileMaker learner, or if you're an older FileMaker developer and you still have objects that are text objects or text field or standard fields. If you are assigning to make those buttons, you're losing out on certain settings on those objects. If I make these objects a button, number one, as soon as I do, I don't like not having full control, and I do not get control over all of the states for this button. The only thing that I get to control is the fact that it is a button. I don't get to control what happens when they hover. I don't get to control what happens when they pressed, and I don't get to control what happens when it's the in focus state because it's not a native button object. It's a text object that is having a script slapped onto it. And that was the old way of doing things pre-FileMaker 12, but it's not the way that I would be doing anything these days in a modern FileMaker database. And frankly, I apologize if this offends you, but I consider it a lazy way of coding a FileMaker database because you aren't taking advantage of the styles. And once I group this and say do a single step, and let's say set variable, we'll just do a blank one and say okay, I've now put myself into a box. Effectively, if I want to make any single changes to any of the individual objects in the group, I might have to ungroup them. Now, I don't have to in this case because it's text. If I double click, I get the button. But if I right click on this, do I get any of the options? Nope. There are some situations where with a grouped object, you can still make some edits to them, like fields. If a field is within that object, you can sometimes change the field by using the inspector. It really depends. But the biggest downside to doing this is in order for me to make any changes to these individual objects, I now have to ungroup the button. So that just wasted my effort. So I ungroup, FileMaker gives me the dialog box, and I say, go ahead, ungroup it. It just ripped the button off of that defined group. And on top of that, if I had set some specific settings to this object, let's say, for example, gosh, that stupid right-clicking when I'm zoomed in. Let's say, for example, this one had conditional formatting, and I'll just put on a true, and I'll say the text color was yellow. And then let's say this one right here, I'm going to give it a tooltip. We'll go to the first tab of the position. Hello there. And we'll put a tooltip on that. And so we should be able to see that that one has a tooltip, that one has that one. I select these, I now group them. They are now grouped. In order for me to make any changes to those individual objects, I cannot. So let's see if I can right click here. Notice that I can't access my conditional formatting, and I can't access my tooltip, and I can't access my hide calculation for each individual object. So my preference would be if you wanted to hide all of these using one particular calculation or one hide calc as opposed to a hide calculation on each of them. And remember, what we are considering here is as we develop and design our layout in FileMaker, we're simply just being aware of the fact that every time that we access the calculation dialog box, and however complex that calculation becomes or is, multiplied times however many times that appears on our layouts, that adds to the complexity that FileMaker has to consider when it's going to render. So, if each of these objects had a complex calculation in order to determine whether or not it should hide, maybe it would be going through relationships and looking at related data and doing a lot of heavy lifting, as I would call it, I want to consider what's going to be better in this scenario, putting that same calculation on multiple objects that FileMaker has to evaluate, or putting it on one object that might be able to just hide them in a different way. So the different way to hide things is you can put an overlay, something on top of it that will be transparent, that will then become opaque and obscure it. That's number one. Another way is you can use a containment object. Say, for example, a slider where I might use a slider. Now here's the trade-off on this, as I get rid of the other dots of this slider, and then I use one of the styles, which is available in all of the themes from FileMaker Themes, is a transparent style. I just select this slider, I go to this, I choose transparent slider. It makes it a completely transparent slider, which the only way I would know this is here is by looking at the layout objects. It is somewhat hidden. I do need to turn off the dots, by the way. So I'll turn off the show navigation dots. So now this is basically just a panel, but it's completely transparent. This would be a way that I would be able to, let's get in that HUD, and we'll turn off the swipe gestures. This would be a way where I can now use one object in order to hide both of these objects. So I would be able to go here. I'm going to need, this is difficult to do, by the way, when you know that the object, when you can't see the bounds of the object. So one of the things that we do here is we temporarily turn on our lines or our fill, either one. I prefer to use lines, and we set those to solid so I can see what I'm doing while I'm designing. I move my two objects within that one object, which is a containment object, obviously a slider. I can see as I drag it out that the object is fully contained. Resize that, ungroup that because I didn't assign a button, what have you, and I will place the one hide calculation now on this one object, and that would make it go away. So we select on the hide right here, and I give it the simple true just for testing purposes. And now I've reduced the layout overhead here so that when I'm in browse mode, that one object that contains all of the different objects that I want to hide is now hidden. So rather than having grouped them. So hopefully I've conveyed sort of the downside to grouping and why I don't do it. But there are, in all situations, times where you might want to group something. All right, so we've gone over a little today, and it is close to the holidays, so I am more than happy to stick around. I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover about the layout objects. The final thing I will say up here at the top is this format painter. It used to be that you didn't want to use the format painter, and that was when they were making a transition right around FileMaker 12, 13 versions, because it added a lot of extra CSS, and a lot of users didn't know that it was adding a lot of weight to a particular object. But nowadays, using the eyedropper to get the style settings of an object and then apply it to another is pretty much okay. Just remember, we never leave our layouts with red triangles. I've said this over and over in previous videos. Red, you're dead. A saying from in the US where we have the little safety trigger on guns. If it's out and it's red, you could shoot your foot off, or even worse. So that's the last of the layout objects. So there's that little tool right there up at the top, and I've expressed what I wanted to express about grouping. Let's get to our questions. If you have a question about anything about FileMaker, I'm more than happy to stick around. Christmas season here, so I'm going to give you a little gift here of that. So let's switch over and see what we've got there in terms of the questions as I bring those up on screen and we take a look. If we've got anything, just a few of them here. Question, Rana asks, can we conditionally set a field available or unavailable in browse mode? I need this while browsing a record. User must click edit to become available a field in browse mode to not accidentally change it. You can use the hide calculation. The hide settings, let's switch back over here. If you do or don't want anything to show on the layout based on a condition, your control is right here with this hide object when. And you can use this calculation to control whatever behavior you want for it to show. And when other conditions change, say a user enters a value into a field and that value matches something that you want it to match, you can then reveal the field for what you want it to do. You can also additionally use conditional formatting, which is an older way of hiding things. For example, you would use conditional formatting to make the color of this text the same color as the background if you wanted it to disappear. So that would just be a trick. I hope that answers the question there. Let's head back to the questions and take a look. and see if there's a follow-up to that. I think I got that. I need this while browsing a record. User must click edit to become... Yeah, you can definitely make it so that they click a button and then you set a variable or you change a field, and the change to that field in turn causes the hide calculation to reveal fields that you now want the user to see. Hey, Wally, and hi, Matt. Thanks for all these good tutorials. Do you know any news on your wish to get calcs inside position fields, e.g. such as 952, the being of interest? WebTom, you'll have to give me a little bit more clarification. I'm trying to think about what you're asking here. Do you know of any news on your wish to get calcs inside the position fields? Oh, I know what you're talking about. I have, and that's a -22. I was looking at that as 954-22. My fault. Yeah, I want to do, gosh, I would love to have that. I will tell the engineers yet again, please support that. Would be so helpful. With the new layout objects tool, you can control specific conditions of grouped objects. Still better not grouping. Yes, Fernando is saying that, again, grouping, I'm just not a big fan of it, and I only group as a last resort. But you do have the ability with the layout objects now. So with these objects contained within this, if I go to my layout objects tool, here's the extent of what I have access to. I can see that the panel is selected right here in the layout objects. I am able to do some, if this was grouped, let's group them, and we'll Command R. We can see that FileMaker puts them into this group, which does add a little bit of CSS. I can select these individually, and from here I can make changes. So as I was saying, one of the things that we would be able to do is if these were fields that were grouped together, I would be able to select this field right here, and then I would be able to change the field by selecting and changing the field without ungrouping. But some things we don't have access to. Say, for example, what I was saying, when it comes to grouping, prior to this palette right here, there was no way of getting to the individual settings, such as the tooltip or the conditional formatting, without ungrouping. You had to ungroup. But how would you do that if you do have groups? So this is a good question. You would be able to select this object right here. This is selected, that one. These are grouped. I can see clearly that they are. The way that I can modify them is either directly in the inspector, or if the inspector doesn't provide that option, you can go up to the menu command. And I think I might be able to right-click. Nope. As soon as I right-click, it selects the whole group. But I should be able to access all of the features here in the menus, where I can get access to my format and conditional. Wrong one. So I select that one, and I go up to format and conditional. So I can get to the individual settings, but still it's just a little bit more of a hassle when this palette provides us with the ability to select individual objects or filter them down, so that we really don't even need to have them grouped. You really have to have a good reason in order to have those groupings. Do you get the idea that I don't like groups for some reason? All right, so let's head back over and see if we got any more questions that came in here. Looks like we don't. And we've got a strong number of 17 people watching this live. And if no one has any questions, that's going to wrap it up. This is going to be the last video for those of you watching live prior to the Christmas season, and I take a break. So get your FileMaker questions ready. I'll be drumming up some new content, and I will be back in about a week. So to you, I am going to leave you with my closeout here. You're always welcome to head over to FileMakerMagazine.com and check out more content there. I've got many years. Of course, subscribe here on YouTube and be notified, and the next video in this series will come up right here. So next time, happy holidays to you and yours, and until next time, happy FileMaking.